Hello and welcome to this episode of Let's Talk Forensic Psychology. We're really lucky and very honoured tonight to have Dr. Itiel Dror with us. He's a principal consultant and researcher. His academic work is really fascinating. He looks at human performance and cognition, and he looks at how we make the decisions and how we're biased in our decision making. He's published dozens of peer-reviewed scientific articles and serves as an associate editor and on editorial boards of several journals. He's also won the Association for British Psychological Annual Chairman's Award for Excellence in Business Psychology. So his speciality is looking at how the brain works and and then translating that into practical everyday domains. So I'll leave you to talk a bit more about it, Itiel, but I wonder if you could tell us to begin with how you sort of got into forensic psychology.
Okay, so trying not to go back to prehistoric times.
That's fine, go back as far as you like.
I'm a cognitive neuroscientist, so I study the brain and the brain as a processing information machine. How do people make observations? What do they perceive? How they interpret information, judgment, and decision making. And I focus on expert decision making, not only on forensic, but I look at aviation, policing, banking, medical, a whole range of expert domains. And in those experts' domain, I'm interested why competent, smart, motivated experts make mistakes, unintentional mistakes, why smart people do stupid things. It's not interesting why stupid people do stupid things, but why do smart people do sometimes, and we all do sometimes stupid things. Specifically in forensic science, I got into it. I get into forensic psychology through forensic science, and I get to forensic science through a fingerprint examiner who read of some work I've done in aviation, on error in aviation, and he read it, and he dropped me an email and said, this is what we do in forensic science. He was a fingerprint examiner. I said, great, let's come and talk. And he came and I talked into in my office, and we were talking, and we had this great conversation because I said, you know, pilots in aviation, in military aviation, the Air Force, sometimes they're upside down, so they don't know the orientation when they have to identify another aircraft. And he said, we two fingerprint examiners don't know the orientation of the latent print. And we're having this great conversation until I said, if the pilot is expecting an enemy aircraft from a certain area of space and a friendly aircraft comes in, they're more likely to make a mistake because of their expectations. So he said, no, we fingerprint examiners are different. We're not affected by expectation. I said, what? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. He said, no, we fingerprint examiners are. So I said, let's do an experiment and let's go and take real cases where fingerprint examiners made an ID, 100% an ID, testified in court, and give the same pair of fingerprints to the same fingerprint examiner, but now give them an expectations that they don't match. For example, to say to them that the suspect, was in jail at the time, or somebody else confessed to the crime, or something like that. And he said, oh, you're wasting your time. None of them will change your mind because it's based on the actual print, on the minutiae, on the friction ridge. So I said, entertain me, let's the data. And we collected the data, and of course, many of them said it's not a match on the same pair of fingerprints that they said and testified in court is a match, and 100% I can't be wrong, not like I think so. So that was how I went into forensic science, and then from fingerprint we moved to DNA and to firearms and forensic pathology, and then the forensic psychology comes in, which I hope not to offend you or too many people, which I have a habit of doing, and I do apologize, but I say what it is. I believe that and again, I'm not a forensic scientist or a forensic psychologist, but generally speaking, forensic psychology is less objective than forensic science. But even forensic science, some areas are very objective, like drug analysis and toxicology, and some are more subjective in nature, let's say like a handwriting identification or voice identification. So I'm sure that also in forensic psychology, but generally speaking, when a forensic psychologist has to determine if someone is competent to stand trial, or they're likely to reoffend, or they go to a house visit to determine if the parents are competent or not, or child has to be, this is more subjective than, generally speaking, than forensic science. And subjective is not a nasty word. Many people say, oh, subjectivity. There's subjectivity everywhere. However, the more subjectivity you have, the more leeway you have to go the wrong direction based on contextual information. It's a more fertile ground to make mistakes based on contextual bias. It doesn't mean you will if you take measurements, but it's more open. So that's kind of I know I've talked for a long time, but it's a short story of how I got to forensic psychology. But I'm not interested in forensic psychology or forensic science or aviation or medicine or banking. It sounds like a lot of different things, but on a cognitive perspective, they are very, very similar in terms of observing data, making judgment, interpretation. Even though forensic psychology and forensic science are a bit different from the other domains, and I can explain why if you want, but generally speaking, they're all similar, how the brain processes information.
And what have you found, Itiel, about how we do that? So how we as humans make decisions, like, and what kind of pitfalls do we tend to fall into?
Basically, in a nutshell, the brain, even though it's fascinating and has a lot of power, and all this late talking about ChatGPT and artificial intelligence and all of this AI, there's no intelligence in it at all, and people are much smarter than those computer technologies. Nevertheless, the brain has a limited resources, a limited capacity. We can't process all the information. So the brain has evolved over millions of years to deal with it. So we have a lot of cognitive mechanisms to get the task done, even though the brain cannot process all the information. We chunk information, we have selective attention, a whole range of issues, shortcuts, if you wish, how we can get to do what we need to do, find shelter, hunt for food in the past, and do what we want to do, given the brain resources. So those shortcuts are part of being intelligent, not taking data at the face value. So we have experience, we have expectation, we have training, we have wisdom. So when information comes in, the human mind is not a camera. The brain is active. We have what we call a lot of top-down processing, where we make judgments on information coming in, not only based on that information, but based on a lot of other stuff. Usually, it is great, but sometimes it can take us in the wrong direction. And the question is, what contextual information should we use to support our perception decision-making? And then we can get into areas where I hope we all agree. And some areas, there's a big discussion, is this relevant or not? For example, if we take in forensic psychology, and you can correct me if I'm a forensic psychologist and I go to visit at home to report to the court about if a child should be removed or not from the house. I hope we all agree that it shouldn't matter if the parents are black or the parents are white. The race shouldn't matter. Then in an area that I think shouldn't matter, but I think it probably matters a lot, if the parents are a gay couple. And I feel and think that the ideology of the assessor, how he feels about gay marriages, will affect their judgment. If it's a person that is open-minded and doesn't have a problem with this, it won't. But if someone who has personal views against that, that may affect their judgment. I was talking to some forensic pathologists, and he said to me, the other pathologist makes a lot of mistakes about child abuse. I say, why? Because I know, from my own experience, my kids if I see a child under the age of 2 with bruises, I worry a lot. But if the child is 3 or 4, my kids go to the playground, they come full of bruises. But the other forensic pathologist, her kids are very gentle. They never fall down. They're very careful. She never sees a blue mark on her kids coming back from the playground. So when she sees a 4 or 5-year-old toddler with bruises, she thinks it's abuse right away. And again, it's funny how their own personal experiences with their kids impact how they interpret bruises, on a kid. Not that a 4-year-old and 5-year-old cannot have bruises because they're abused, but they may have fallen down, playing in the playground or whatever. So all of this brings into the question how much our personal experience can support and make us an expert, but can also taint our judgment and how we go about things. And if we decide what car to buy or who to get married, that's great. But if we're experts and we come to court and we make assessments on other people's life, I think we need to be very careful on not letting those kind of issues impact our judgment in the wrong way.
No, I agree. I think we've done a lot trying to think about our unconscious biases, but we often don't know. Obviously, by their nature, we don't know what they are. I mean, I always thought what we did was subjective, but I thought that the work that people like pathologists would do would be quite objective, because it was, as you say, fingerprints were quite standard and that people would understand that. And I was really struck when you gave your conference, the DOP conference a few years ago, that it wasn't objective at all. And then more recently, you sent me a paper about people who make decisions in post-mortems. And again, I thought that would be very clear cut that somebody would all see the same thing. But you talked in your paper about the colour of the skin affecting what decision people make, which was really shocking. When I read that paper, I thought, how could that be? So I was wondering
it's unbelievable that even fingerprint, we're the fingerprint community now. 15 years ago, they said we're objective when I began. They said not only objective, they said and testified in court, we are infallible. We never make mistakes. But now all of them acknowledge it, all the professional fingerprint societies. But still, when I talk to people, they say no. They watch too much CSI on TV and have this Hollywood portrayal. But they're jurors at the end of the day, and even judges. But there's a lot of misbelief. So one of the biggest one is, if you're aware of it, you can control it. So we have a big issue in forensic psychology and forensic science that they're not aware of their biases. But even if you're aware of it, we don't control our brain processes. But in the belief that, I know about my biases, and we don't know about most of them because they're implicit, that by mere willpower we can control them. In fact, all the diversity training that we all do, and millions and billions are spent, we all go and do this online diversity training, which is to increase awareness. It doesn't increase awareness, but even if it does, it doesn't change anything. Awareness by itself is not enough. And the minimum we want is, transparency, because you say, I believe, and we know it's subjective, but how many times when people write a report to the court, they say, here's my subjective opinion and assessment, meaning another expert can have a different opinion, different than mine, and will be a legitimate opinion. They may not necessarily be wrong. So at least if we don't do anything about it, is to at least be transparent about it, which is very difficult. So we have transparency and awareness and taking steps to minimize it. So there's a lot of moving wheels that need to be dealt with, which are not, and people don't like to hear about it. And it's an uphill battle, and I like to say we're winning, but I'm not sure at all.
And I think it's a really important point you make, actually. I think in our role as expert witnesses, there's a lot of weight placed on our reports as forensic psychologists and on our opinions. And in your experience, and what would you recommend and what would you advise forensic psychologists to be doing? I know you spoke about awareness training, but thinking about really all those implicit biases, like what can we be doing to kind of keep ourselves in check?
First of all, we need to acknowledge that we need to do something, because a lot of the mentality is don't fix it if it's not broken, the court accepts it. Forensic domain, very rarely we find out if we made a mistake, and I cannot say that you make a mistake or not, because we don't know if a mistake is made. We don't have the same level of feedback as other experts, which is important not only for modesty, but to learn from experience. Errors are our friends. We learn from mistakes. In the forensic domain, generally, we don't know if we make mistakes. So the first hurdle, which is the biggest one, is to bring the forensic experts to awareness that they're not perfect, they make mistakes, they can be affected by bias and contextual irrelevant information, and that's a problem. Once they acknowledge that, we're halfway to the solution. That the denial and the fighting is the big issue. And every time I come out with research, like the forensic pathologist, that was the first one about the research you were talking about that investigated it, and I published it. They went berserk. They complained to the journal. They tried to have it retracted. They filed complaints against me, tried to get me fired. They filed 8 complaints. They wrote dozens. There's 22 letters to the editor. One of them signed by, I think, 100 forensic pathologists. They were shocked. So they don't want to hear about it. So number one is getting that on board. Once you get that on board, then they need to understand that awareness is not enough. You can't control your thought processes. And if you know some irrelevant contextual information, you can't block it out. People say, I block it out. You can't block it out. And the more you try to block it out, the more it's going to influence you, because the more effort, the more you don't want to think about something, and the more you try not to think about it, the more you're thinking about it. We call it ironic processing or rebound in cognitive science. So willpower is not enough. So you need to take actions. Now, what actions can you take? I can give you a few examples now, but the minute the forensic people understand the problem, they can come up with their own ways to deal with it. It's not rocket science. It's not so complicated if you acknowledge the problem. But if, the biggest word in English. So what can you do? First of all, there are 2 issues, I would say. One is what information you know and when you know it. So the question, first of all, what information do you need? Before you even deal with a case, what information do you need? So when you make an assessment, what information is relevant to you? And of course, you need to decide. The expert in the domain will decide it, not somebody like me who doesn't understand the domain. I'm not an expert in forensic psychology. So you will need to decide, should you take into account whether the person has a criminal record, how old they are, how many kids, their income, their race, I don't know, all the information that you get on a case. Do you need it? Is it relevant for you? And you can say yes, you can say no, it's up to you. But if certain information is not relevant to you, and talking to many forensic psychologists and forensic science, they say, oh, I know a lot about the case, things that I don't need to know to make my expert judgment. Well, if you don't need to know them, better not to know them and to be blind to that information. So that is one category of issues. And we can discuss a practicality. How can I buffer the information? And we can talk about case manager and bias cascades and a few techniques how to actually achieve it. But first of all, is understanding that, yes, you're exposed to irrelevant contextual information, figuring out what it is and acknowledging that it can be harmful and bias you. So this is a whole range of questions of what information you know. Then information that you need to know, the question is when. And for this, we have a technique called linear sequential unmasking, LSU. If you get the same information in a different order, often you reach a different conclusion, because the first piece of information, not only that you remember it better, the primacy effect, but it generates ideas. It determines how you're going to treat the next piece of information. So we even do it with, police investigators. They get a whole bunch of evidence, who committed the armed robbery. Some of it says it's suspect A, some of it says it's suspect B, and some of it is ambiguous. If they start with suspect A, they get into a mindset, tunnel vision, that it's suspect A. Then we give them the ambiguous information that can be interpreted either way. They interpret it consistent with A. By the time they get to the suspect B, they've made their mind up, they're escalating commitment, and they reach a conclusion that it's suspect A. If you give them the identical evidence in reverse order, they start with B, they think it's B, they get the ambiguous information, interpret it as B. By the time they get to A, it's like an oil tanker, it's already determined. So then the question is, the information that you need, what is the order you're going to see it? And linear sequential unmasking gives you criteria in what order you need to see it. For example, some information is more objective and some is more subjective. So if you, in a criminal case, you have a witness, an eyewitness, and you have a video recording, you need both of them, but the video recording is going to be more objective than the eyewitness. So start with that. If you have two eyewitnesses and one was sober and one was intoxicated, start with the sober. So start with a stronger objective. Then another criteria, relevance. Some information is very relevant. It's really the core data that you use for your decision. And some of it is relevant, but it's more kind of on the side. It's not the most important piece of information. Start with the more relevant. So we have a bunch of criteria like relevance, objectivity, where you can order the information, the sequence, and you don't have to do it every time. If you sit a bunch of forensic psychologists and say in a typical case where we assess, the likelihood to reoffend, what do we look? We look at the behavior in prison and the past record, and what information is more important? What is more objective? Should we first look at the behavior in prison? Should we first look at the previous conviction? Is it how old they are? And some information that you should never really assess.
That's a really useful advice, because I was thinking what would be the order. So that makes sense. And the most objective and the most, the person who's talking, as you said, the person who's sober rather than the person who's drunk. So that's fascinating, but it makes perfect sense now you say it. But usually
I can interview you, which I want, and say, what kind of assessments you make. So you can give me an example of an assessment you make. And then I can ask you, what information do you use? And then I'll ask you, to make a list and then to rank each one, how objective, how subjective it is. Even in the medical domain, when they make assessments, some assessments are more subjective. Is the patient pale or not? The patient is confused and disoriented. This is a bit subjective relative to blood pressure and the temperature, right? Or weight, exactly. Yeah. That's more objective. And then how is it so this is kind of very clear. And then how important is the blood pressure to determine if they have, a heart attack? How much is it important, disorientation or confusion, to make the same assessment? And this is not something you have to do every time, because it will repeat itself. And there can be a very simple procedure of what information and what order to look at it. And that will increase the reliability of the assessments, in my view.
That's really interesting.
I was just thinking, it's a really interesting point. I was thinking, and certainly in our training, I'm sure Jerry would agree, like one of the things that we do to try and minimize the bias in our own forensic psychology risk assessments is very often you'll have information that's repeated throughout someone's life in various reports, but over time that information gets slightly adapted, and then by the time it gets to us and we're assessing their risk, perhaps for release or for progression through the prison estate, it ends up being a very, very different context. So we're always going back to the original source and looking at the original source rather than the most recent one, and actually how has this developed and evolved, and to try and minimize some of that bias. So
what you're saying is really interesting. What you're saying, not only in terms of what you do, which is great, you're going to the original, but to study how it changed over time and why Why suddenly a piece of information that was really harmful now is unharmful, or something that originally was not harmful, now it sounds terrible, how each one, their biases, unintentionally painted it a bit differently, and to see the evolution of the data over time will be a really interesting study to do.
Definitely, yeah, we do often see that. And I think it's, again, the interpretation of the person who reads what was said, and then they put a slant on it and another slant. And it can be completely different when you go back to the beginning. I mean, what you're saying sounds really that you're saying that people aren't being malicious; they're just coming in with their own biases. But you know, we sort of pride ourselves as psychologists that we would be more objective in looking at material. But generally, for instance, as an expert witness, you'd often be given a dossier of information in probably chronological order. So it's how you then. Would you recommend then sort of taking it apart and thinking what you read first in that case?
Absolutely, I would, and I just want to reiterate what you said. I'm not talking about anybody who does anything malicious or intentional. It's hardworking, dedicated, competent experts. And sometimes they're too dedicated and too motivated. For example, it will be interesting, another study, to understand why certain people went into forensic psychology. Some people, I find it with forensic pathology, they're on a crusade to save children who are abused, which is very honorable, but you have to be careful that it doesn't taint your judgment. So if people go to be a forensic psychology because this happened to them, or they know, and usually I don't respond to posts on LinkedIn, even though I look at them and post from time to time, but don't get discussion. But I couldn't help myself. Just 2 weeks ago, someone posted, and it was also in the newspaper, that forensic science should be used to convict more people. And I wrote, forensic science should be there to convict more people, but forensic science should also be there to make sure there are no wrongful conviction. The same thing, I talked to many forensic scientists, said, oh, I want to put the bad guys away. I'm proud of it. Why are you complaining? I want to be proud of it. Would you want me not to be proud of putting the bad people away? Yes, I absolutely want you to be proud of putting the bad people away, but I want you also equally, not more, but at least equally, to be proud of making sure that innocent people are not convicted. So it's a balanced approach. But if you're on a crusade to save children, or alternatively, someone who was accused of child abuse who was innocent, maybe on your crusade not to accuse wrongful innocent people of abusing children, either way, it's not good. But we're all humans. We all have emotions. We all have motivations. But we need to try to take steps that it doesn't, or minimally taints our judgments on that. So I think, it's definitely not malicious, but sometimes being over motivated is also not good. We need to try to put our emotions aside and try to have a cold professional approach in assessing the evidence and the data, and to make the best judgment we can, given the data.
I was just thinking, it's a real skill, that, actually to be able to do that. I was thinking how emotive forensic psychology is actually, and the stories that we read, and the things that have really harmful things that people have done, but also their own experiences as well, that perhaps might have led to that. But it taps into, I guess, our perhaps our own experiences, or our own kind of moral compasses, and how do you maintain that objectivity? And I guess what you're kind of speaking to is actually, it's not something we have naturally, and even despite all our training, it's something we always need to keep in check,
because
and not to fall into the myth that we're objective expert witnesses. Is actually, we constantly need to be holding that in mind.
The point is that training by itself doesn't help. You cannot have a skill to do that. You need to take actions. So it's a fallacy, the illusion of control. We just did published a research in nurses in forensic wards, where there are some people who are locked up who've done terrible things, that they're put in a mental ward rather than in prison. And we look at the nurses' notes and how they treat pain, and how they treat very differently certain people there who have done horrific stuff. You see it in the notes that they make, even in the medical notes. two patients, same everything, the person who has done something, it's very hard not to let that influence you, but you need to take measures to do what you need to do on an expert level. But it's not a skill or training enough. You need to take actions, whether it's linear sequential unmasking or what information you're available, because you can't block it out. Many times I say people block it out. We can't. You may think you are, but it's in your brain and influencing your judgment and decision making. And this is the hard part to bring across to forensic experts.
Well, it is. I can see that that will be the case, especially if people know, because people don't always know what people have done necessarily. But yeah, it is fascinating how, or even if you find you just don't like the person, I guess it's harder to treat two people the same if you like one and don't like the other one.
Watching the other day TV, a wrestling match, and I already wanted one of them to win against the other. And it's not because they knew anything about them. Right away, we have these emotions. Right away, we have those feelings. And when it comes to going out on a date or having a friend, it's one thing. But if you're somebody who is making professional judgment, it's a very different story, whether you like someone or you don't like someone. On a professional level, the same as a medical doctor, you want them to treat everyone the same, whether they like them or not is irrelevant. But we have these emotions and they tell us treat everyone the same. We can't, because we're people and we have feelings, but we need to minimize that impact on our judgments.
And you made the point that bias doesn't equal prejudice, but it still has such a big impact, doesn't it? Whether you're prejudiced or not, it's having an impact. Even if you're purposely trying not to be prejudiced, it's still having a bias either way. You still have an impact.
Absolutely. But again, the problem is convincing the expert that it had an impact, because they don't know about it. And I remember with fingerprinting, when I started, then I said, yes, the same fingerprint, when you look at the minutiae, look at the friction ridge to decide if they match or not, the brain sees them as a match if you believe that they're a match, because the person confessed to the crime, and they see it as a non-match if someone else confessed to the crime. It's the same fingerprint. And I remember the first time I was training fingerprint examiner, I really annoyed them, and somebody got up in the middle and said, the fingerprint doesn't lie. And that is true, but what I said, the fingerprint doesn't speak. It's a human person that has to look. The same thing, we do experiments, and here we're talking not on psychological assessment, but just looking at similarities. So if we give people, we do that, two faces of two men, and they have to make a judgment how similar the faces are. And they do it in forensic science, right? If somebody goes to a cash point machine and steals money, they have camera, then they catch a suspect, and it is the same person, from the CCTV. Now we tell half the people, these two men are brothers, or these two men are strangers. And then we show two women, and we say that to half the people, these women are sisters, to the other half they're strangers. And you have to tell us how similar the faces are. And they look at the same faces. If they believe they're genetically related, if they believe they're family, their experience is that family look. And they see the similarity. The brain sees those two faces as more similar. When they see the same faces, but believe they're not genetically related, they don't expect them to be similar, and they don't look as similar. The expectation drives it a lot. And it just happened to me even 2 weeks ago. I went and met someone, and he was talking to another person, and I just, didn't think anything of it. And then he said, this is my son. And the minute my son, I looked at, oh, now I see the similarity. It was there all along or not, but again, this drives, and this is just, I can give you example after example after example, and experts are not immune from it, especially in domains where there's a lot of discretion and judgment and interpretation, like forensic psychology. And that's not a bad thing, but you have to be very, very careful not to let your emotion and expectations take you if it's based on contextual, irrelevant, when you yourself, not somebody else, you yourself said, I shouldn't take it into account. It's irrelevant to my judgment when I make a judgment about reoffending or competent to stand trial. This piece of information got nothing to do with it, then don't have it. because it may impact you.
Because part of the research that you did about the pathologist was that the person who brought the body to the mortuary, did they take it to the mortuary for the examination? And that affected what decision they made. And again, which shouldn't really make any difference whether it was a mother or the grandmother or the mother's boyfriend.
Mother's boyfriend,
yeah.
This is exactly a point of argument. So the forensic pathologists disagree with me. They said, yes, I can take into account who brought them in the hospital. It's legitimate to say that the child fell down the stairs if the grandmother brought the child, but if it's a mother's boyfriend, no, I don't believe them. I say there was abuse here, even if the autopsy is exactly the same. So I totally disagree. I think it's totally wrong, but at least it's on the table for a discussion, what is relevant and what is not relevant. Is it relevant that who brought them to the hospital or not? And then discussing what should and what shouldn't be used in making such assessments.
So would that generally enter a decision in that? So I would, again, not having been in this field of pathology, you wouldn't think that that would make a difference as to what decision you'd make on how a person died, as who brought them to the hospital?
A, yes, and B, if they do that, which I think is totally wrong, at least be transparent to say to in the medical report, based on the post-mortem, based on all of this, I cannot decide if they fell down the stairs or it's a murder, but only because it's a mother's boyfriend, I decide it's murder. Then at least it's transparency. The problem is hidden as medical evidence. And now we have a new paper out in forensic pathology where they get a post-mortem and they have to decide if a person was homicide or suicide. It's a single gunshot to the head. Now, when it's not ambiguous, if somebody died and they have 10 bullet holes to the brain, we know it's not suicide, right? But if it's one bullet hole, one gunshot, and we give them the autopsy finding, the medical findings, and they decide, if some said it's homicide, some say it's suicide, great. And then we give them the opposite information. So if they decided based on the medical information that it's suicide, now they get the context that it's homicide. If they decided homicide, now they get contextual that it's suicide. And you won't believe it. The vast majority of them change the decision that was based on medical post-mortem to fit the context. That is the power of context. The context will override the medical findings. And there's no transparency. That's why we want transparency. So linear sequential unmasking doesn't only say what order you get the information. We want to hear, we want you to document after each piece of information what you think. So we see how that piece of information contributed to your decision. And you can change your decision, but we'll have transparency, what information influenced you in what way. So when you have your final conclusion, we know what you took into account. So let's say, I'm just, inventing this. Let's say you look at their past criminal record and you say, oh, I think this person will offend again because, they've been in jail, 25 times. Every time they get released, they get offended. And then you read how they've changed in the last year, and in jail they've behaved very differently. And you say, you know what, I'm really considering it, and I think they're probably not, they're less likely to offend because of that. And that's legitimate, and that's fine, but we see what piece of information, so there's great transparency for the court and to have discussions among the experts. All good. I don't see a problem in doing that.
Absolutely fascinating. And for you, Itiel, what are the next steps for you in terms of your research? Have you got anything ongoing at the moment, or what would be your kind of dream research the next step?
We have I am working very, very hard to work less, and I'm failing because I'm doing too much. So I'm working hard to work less. So we have a whole bunch of projects. A few projects I want to mention where we're looking at safety in rail, in trains, and I'm just finishing to investigate a plane crash in pilot decision making. So we're looking at different domains, but we've seen forensic and the criminal justice system. We have a new paper, like I Don't Have Enough Enemies, showing bias in judges, the bias of the judges. And we believe that it's very good to have diversity and they're having more women and minorities. That's great, but we're saying that's a very superficial approach. We want diversity in experience, diversity in ideology. And what happens in the United States, in the UK, they don't even know. In the United States, the vast majority of judges come from the prosecution, regardless if they're white or black, men or women or whatever. And there are people who went into the prosecution, were trained in the prosecution and worked in the prosecution. And you can take the prosecutor out of the prosecution office, but you can't take the mentality and the training that they've had for decades. And we show how the judges who come from the prosecution rule more for the prosecution versus judges who come from the public defense. So what we're saying in the new paper, great, continue to hire more women and minorities, this is all great, but we want also diversity in experiences. We want judges to have more and more judges who also come from the defense, from the ideology of not being tough on crime, but human rights, not having wrongful convictions, to have both kind of judges. In the UK, I try to find out, and I wrote and talked to the Ministry of Justice, to the Statistics Office, how many judges come from the prosecution versus the defense. They don't even know. They don't even have that information. They can tell me how many women and how many minorities and a lot of information. They collect data on people who apply and people who serve as judges, but they say we don't even know that because they don't even occur to them that that's very, very important. So we look at diversity. It's not a matter of your gender and sex and your race and religion and sex orientation, which I'm all for, but I think we need to look at it because we've shown very clearly that judges have biases too. And a big bias is their professional history and experience. And in the paper, we go into detail, why did they choose to go to the prosecution? And the training and the ideology and a lot of things, by the time they get to be judges, they already have a certain attitude. And if we want a bias in the court, it needs to be for the defense. Because the reason we have courts, the reason is, a via corpus, going back to the Magna Carta, the burden of proof is on the prosecution, right? And people are allowed to know what they're accused of, and they have a defense. And the burden of proof is on the prosecution. The entire court system is to protect people from being convicted and prosecuted for crimes they haven't been. So the entire system was invented and created to protect individual rights. And now it's a bit in this new paper. So that's a big project we're working on. But again, it's not pleasant to hear. But if we want to improve, we need to look and be brave and to acknowledge the issues and problems, and then we can take steps to try to minimize those issues. So we're doing a project on this. We have a new project with forensic pathologists, a third study that we've just submitted for publication, and we have a whole bunch of other stuff that I'm just thinking about it. I'm getting overwhelmed.
This is you taking it easy.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I'd hate to hear you telling us what you do when you've been busy.
Yeah.
So it's great to talk to you. And as you see, I get excited about it because I'm passionate about it. Yeah. But it's also, I have to say, very frustrating, you take one step forward, 2 steps back, and sometimes you feel it's like, you're swimming against the current. And, the personal abuse and hatred, and I do get it, from people, personal comments, it's unpleasant, but I'm more worried about the domain, not making really significant changes to improve. But, change is difficult and takes time, especially when it comes to policing and the criminal justice system, I think.
So how do you cope with getting that? Because, I know we often get criticized for the job we do and why we do it and that sort of thing. But how do you cope with getting sort of personal attacks on when you're giving objective evidence?
One thing I do, I cannot say it's successful, but one thing I do is when they attack me personally, I say they can't attack my data, they can't attack my research, so they go after me personally. Also, again, this is maybe BS I give myself to feel better. Also, I think that if everybody likes you, and I know managers like that, everybody likes them, they're not doing anything. Change, you're going to get resistance from people. And this is part of it, and it takes time to change, and especially when you're talking about implicit bias and something like this, you know, the fingerprint examiner that I was telling you about, after we did the study, he wanted to resign. He said, I've been doing it for 23 years, I'm proud of it, my family is proud. Suddenly I find that it's subjective, that I'm biased. I said, no, it's not such a big problem. If we acknowledge it, we can do, but it was a shock to them to say that, especially that they don't see their errors. So, you know, I don't mind professional criticism. I love a scientific debate, and I learn from it, and I make mistakes myself. But it gets very, very personal and emotional in the forensic domain, and that is a pity, and it's unpleasant personally. You know, I just take it, but I'm more worried about, you know, what is out there, about people who are guilty, who go free, and people who are innocent, who can be convicted, or people who are released from jail, who shouldn't be released from jail, or people who are not released from jail, who should. And you can come up with your own example. The decisions you make are so important. They have such value, and the court takes you so seriously. We need to try to get it right. And I'm not saying you get it wrong, and I'm not saying you're not doing well, but you always need to try to do better and look if there's weaknesses and improve all the time.
No, I think it's really important that you challenge us in this way, because I mean, we do take our, you know, the decisions we make really seriously, but it is, you know, you have to know that you can make mistakes, and none of us can, even, you know, we don't know what the person did and whether they did it or not, and, you know, whether they're going to go and do it again. We don't know that, do we? It's not an exact science in any way.
This is the first sentence I do when I train forensic psychologists. They say, I'm going to challenge you today. I'm going to push you out of your comfort zone. I'm going to be provocative. People who like to get out of the comfort zones and to be challenged, we're going to have a great day. People who feel uncomfortable, I apologize. I'm going to do it anyhow because it's important domain, but you're going to feel uncomfortable because I am going to challenge you and take you out of your comfort zone. Some people love it, some people don't. But as an expert who goes to court, who writes report, who people's lives depend on, you need to do it. You owe it to your domain. And if you don't like it, if you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen. Don't be a forensic psychologist if you're not willing to do that.
That's really true. So I think on that note, all that's left to say is let's talk forensic psychology.